All right, we are recording. Lee, you can take it away.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our symposium today titled Conflict in Organizations Across Time, Levels, and Methods. My name is Lee Zhuang, and I will be the co-chair for this session. First, I would like to get a general overview of the topic. Conflict has been known to be inevitable in organizational life. Generally speaking, when we talk about conflict, we often understood it as the real or perceived experience of incompatibility or disagreement in relation to goals or interests between two or more parties. In our symposium today, we have 4 fantastic research studies related to conflict using different theories, methods, and level of analysis that complement one another. In the first study, we have Davis, Weingart, and Cohen examining the relationship between well-being and conflict expression at the individual level. In the second study, we have Zhuang, myself, and Waldman examining the effect of political skill on conflict expression over time. In the third study, we have Oslis and Allen examining conflict trajectories and team performance. And last but not least, we have Leo and O'Neill uses thematic analysis to study conflict at the team and multi-team system levels. Throughout this session, Dr. Waldman, the chair of the symposium, will serve as a discussant and ask questions to tie the 4 studies together. We hope that you enjoy our session and the work done here will inspire you to better understand conflict and further conduct research in this area. And we'll get to Matt next.
All right, thanks so much, Lee. Hopefully this screen sharing works properly. All right, just checking. You can all see my slides, yes?
Yep, looks good.
Fantastic. All right, well, thank you so much for joining our asynchronous symposium here at InGroup this year. So I'm really excited to present this work to you. My name is Matthew Davis. I am a 5th-year PhD student in organizational behavior at Carnegie Mellon's Tepper School of Business. And this work I'm conducting with professors Laurie Weingart and Taya Cohen, also at the Tepper School of Business at Carnegie Mellon. And in this work, we're looking at the impact of individual well-being on interpersonal conflict expression. So when we say individual well-being, we're talking about things like satisfaction with life and a generally stable sense of self-esteem, and how these impact how people express themselves when in conflict with others. And so to get an important definition out of the way, when I say conflict expression, I'm talking about the verbal and nonverbal communication of opposition between people. And conflict expression can vary in terms of its levels of directness and oppositional intensity. So directness, for example, is the degree to which conflict expression is unambiguous, and oppositional intensity is, for example, the degree to which a person's stated positions in a conflict are really entrenched. And as conflict expression gets lower in directness and or higher in oppositional intensity, it starts to take these sort of forms like arguing, disguising, or undermining, which can cause conflict to intensify or unhelpfully stagnate and can actually harm relationships. Whereas conflict expression high in directness and low in oppositional intensity tends to take more of the form of a debate, which can help conflict to resolve and actually help maintain relationships through conflict. So here's where individual well-being comes in. So people higher in well-being tend to have healthy, stable personalities, and how people feel about themselves and their life impacts how they communicate with others, because it impacts their goals in communication when in conflict with others. So to explain that a little bit more, people who are low in well-being, for example, tend to have more social anxiety, a more unstable sense of self-worth. They tend to be less self-sufficient, and they're more prone to the effects of stress. So especially when in conflict with others, we would expect them to have more self-protective goals. Whereas people higher in well-being tend to have more social confidence, they're less likely to experience threat from social situations like conflict, and they manage stressful situations better. They also tend to build and maintain more positive and trusting interpersonal relationships that they value as part of their identity more. And so we would say that especially when in conflict, they would have relationship preserving goals. And so this leads us to our main hypothesis, which is that well-being should be associated with forms of conflict expression that would help to resolve conflict and maintain relationships through conflict. And so specifically, we would expect that well-being would be associated with less arguing, disguising, and undermining, and more debate. And so we test this with an online experiment where participants were presented with a vignette in which they were in conflict with a colleague in a workplace situation. And we manipulated the form of conflict expression of the colleague so that the colleague approaches the participant in this vignette, either starting an argument with them, debating with them, undermining them, or disguising. We also included a baseline without any conflict expression just for comparison purposes. So in that baseline, we just said, you haven't, had a chance to talk with your colleague yet. And finally, the dependent variable of interest here is that after participants were done reading this vignette where they're in conflict with their colleague, we measured the form of conflict expression that participants report that they would use in response to their colleague after the beginning of this exchange. And so here's what we found. So in line with what we predicted, we found that indeed well-being was significantly inversely associated with arguing, disguising, and undermining. So again, those are those forms of conflict expression that cause conflict to escalate or unhelpfully stagnate and can harm relationships. But we did not find the positive association with debate that we were expecting to find. Now, before I move on, I do want to briefly mention, what you see here in terms of, this smattering of significant effects caused by the different conditions. So this wasn't the focus of the study, but it's important to mention what this means. So sort of taken holistically, what we're seeing here is that indeed the form of conflict expression of the colleague affects the way the participant responded. So if you just think about that from your point of view, when you're in conflict with someone, how they approach you and how they're expressing themselves in that conflict, of course, affects the way we want to respond. But that underscores the importance of our finding is that while controlling for those effects caused by the conflict expression of the colleague, we see these significant effects of well-being on response. And so this leads us to the general conclusions from our study that well-being is associated with less conflict expression that causes conflict to escalate and stagnate. And this is true while controlling for the form of conflict expression of the counterpart. So the general takeaway is that problematic conflict expression is in part the result of the level of well-being of the parties in the conflict. And well-being may be an important safeguard then against conflict escalation and stagnation that may be robust across the different situations or conflict expressions of the counterparty. And so our next step is to move on from vignette studies to actually examining conflict expression and behaviors in interpersonal contexts. All right, well, thank you so much for your time and attention during this presentation. And because these presentations are pretty short and asynchronous, I encourage you to email me with any questions that you may have. My email is mdiabes@cmu.edu. Thanks again and enjoy the rest of our presentations in the conference.
Thank you, Matthew. And actually, you saved yourself a minute, so I am going to ask one question. I really love about this particular work that you flip sort of the regular paradigm on its head and look at well-being as the antecedent rather than as the outcome. But I wanted to ask what your thoughts are on sort of like, what is the causality you expect to be real in the real world? This is sort of unidirectional. Do you think it's bidirectional? Do you think that conflict expression also has an impact on well-being? How do those two variables really play together over time?
Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and it does, I think it's important consideration to have, considering that this is really a very thin snapshot of what a conflict would look like, right? This is one situation, one volley. We would expect conflict expression to be multiple, volleys. People could take their feelings from one conflict and of course transfer to future conflicts with that same person. A bad exchange can ruin your day and affect how you, talk to someone else later on in that day. So of course we expect these things to be more dynamic than how we've looked at it here. But in general, well-being tends to be relatively stable. So a person's well-being, these general factors tend to, are in part caused by things as stable as genetic factors, hormonal factors, different things like that. There all also are more proximal factors that lead to well-being as well. But, it just speaks to the general stability of well-being. And so there can be over time potentially some sort of a feedback loop, you can think of it that way, where a person may have kind of repeated, if you take, for example, someone with low well-being, they might have repeated conflicts where things tend to escalate, things tend to get worse in conflict. And so there could end up being this learned behavior that conflict's a bad thing, conflict is something to avoid. So these conflict situations end up playing into the general sense of low well-being, of being unsatisfied with how things go. So yeah, I would expect these things to almost reinforce over time. And whereas, a person higher in well-being might have better satisfaction from their conflicts, better resolution of their conflicts. And so it could self-reinforce as well. So that's kind of, generally what I would expect in terms of a dynamic relationship.
It's a lot to think about. Thanks. All right, Lee, are you next? Oh, you're muted still.
Great. This is a human error of Zoom calls or.
And now our audience should love us.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, next is, so in this study, we examined the relationship between political skill and conflict expression in teams over time. So just a general quick introduction. Existing theory of conflict has established that conflict is both beneficial and detrimental to a team functioning. Because of its potential for such benefit and damage, it is important that we continue to better understand how it emerges and change over time, and how to effectively manage conflict within a team. In the current study, we examine the recently developed conflict expression theory, which posits that conflict message can be understood via two dimensions: directness and oppositional intensity. Matt has covered a lot about the theory itself, so I'm just going to talk a lot more about the political skill side. So in a team, it is very important that conflict can be effectively managed, and the construct of political skill provides an important potential understanding as to how that could be the case. More specifically, political skill is defined as one's ability to be able to understand the situation and the context that they are in, and effectively influence people to meet their own goals. So this construct consists of 4 dimensions. First one is social astuteness, which refers to a person's ability to be able to read the situation effectively. The second dimension is interpersonal influence, refers to their ability to be able to effectively influence other people. And the third one is networking ability, refers to their ability to make connections with others. And finally, apparent sincerity, refers to their ability to do all of the above while also being perceived as sincere. So in the focus of the study here, so we want to examine how team composition and political skill kind of predict all of these 4 different forms of conflict expression. So in the first set of a hypothesis, we think that teams with higher level of political skills are more likely to engage in debate because they want to resolve the conflict, disguised if they choose to overlook the conflict and move past it. And furthermore, these teams are less likely to engage in arguing and undermining because they understand that these are not effective methods for expressing conflict. For the second set of hypothesis, we want to examine how political skill, team composition of political skill can impact conflict expression over time. More specifically, we want to look at argue and undermine, as they are the 2 types of conflict that have a lot of potential for conflict escalatory spiral. So we believe that teams with lower level of political skill will engage in greater increases in arguing and undermining over time because they do not have the ability to effectively communicate and influence others in the presence of conflict. And finally, for our third set of hypothesis, Arguing, undermining, and disguising will not be beneficial to team performance because they do not necessarily solve the conflict that's there, while debating encourages discussion and information exchange across team member, hence the positive improvement in team performance. So to conduct this study, the method consists of the following. For our sample, we have 24 engineering student team working on a senior capstone project. The total sample consisted of 166 students, which each sample size ranges from 4 to 11 team members. To kind of do the survey, we sent out 6 surveys for student teams to complete. In the first survey, which was the individual differences survey, which we put in a lot of other constructs, but primarily this is where we assess political skill. And in the 5-team process survey, we assess other team processes and emergent states. So here we ask questions related to team, like conflict expression and team performance. And the measures that we use for this current study, we use the DICE measure, or direct intensity conflict expression, developed by Befar and colleagues. To measure political skill, we use the political skill inventory developed by Ferris and colleagues. And to measure subjective team performance, we use the measure developed by Early and Gibson. The results of our first hypothesis showed that when controlled for team size, political skill significantly negatively predicted disguising, arguing, and undermining, while no significant results were found for debate, showing that our hypothesis 1 was partially supported. For the second hypothesis, we did not find any support. However, we found that the trajectories of conflict expression over time showed that teams with higher level of political skill generally engage in less arguing and undermining. For arguing though, they engage in less arguing early on for teams with higher level of political skill, but eventually over time, we see that they eventually converge just as much as engaging into arguing with teams with lower level of political skill. Then for our third hypothesis, the results showed that arguing, undermining, and disguising all negatively impact team performance, while no significant findings was found for debate, partially supporting our third hypothesis. The current study contributes to the conflict literature in the following way. First, for theoretical implication, we extended the nomological network of conflict expression with political skill and team performance. We also answered for a previous call on more research on political skill at team level, as well as examining team dynamics over time. The big takeaway in terms of practical implication here we see is that teams with higher level of political skill are less likely to engage in damaging conflict expression, especially early on. However, there's some caveats to this current study that requires some consideration before interpreting all the things that we have here. The 2 primary limitations that we have here is that we conduct and use a small student sample, and also we use self-reported measure. So conflict expression is highly dynamic, and potentially using other methodology could capture and understanding the way that people communicate conflict better. So going into future directions, one of the things that we certainly should think about is connecting these different theories together, looking at using the tripartite model of conflict by Jen to examine how that relates to each conflict expression types or forms. Also, conflict is something that is not just aggregated or shared across the team. And so a recent publication by Parks and colleagues talks about how we viewed this dynamically or from the network angle, and that each individual have their own perception and the way that they express conflict in a team create more complexity around that. In this current study, we used a simple aggregation compositional model of just taking the mean of team political skill to examine how that relates to conflict expression. So other compositional model that relates to more compilational approach. So for example, like identify the strategic role of the team and see whether political skill of that strategic core would relate to conflict expression and team performance over time would be important. And then lastly, using some qualitative methodology to examine conflict as from both angle of conflict types as well as conflict expression can be very helpful in better understanding these conflict dynamics. That's the references that I have, and thank you.
All right. You also have just enough time for one short question. I wanted to highlight there the connection between the two first papers in terms of really seeing a similar set of findings for the arguing, undermining, disguising piece, but that debate part just not quite working out as expected. So Lee, you want to give a brief thought as to what might be going on there with the debate piece?
I think there's just a lot of stuff, but the immediate thought that come into mind is really tapping into that network approach right there. I think that, potentially even when it comes to a debate within a team, like how do we go about doing it? So is it necessarily the whole entire group and the whole entire team engaging in debate? Or is it something that like only one person kind of talk about, or a few people within the team talks about there? That is something that we kind of talk about. And I think even relating to the aspect of conflict contagion, or the aspect of coalition formation in the conflict contagion model will reveal a lot of interesting finding in that. But furthermore, I think we kind of have to dig deeper into that. And I think debate has a lot of interesting aspect that we go about in there. But potentially could be a measurement issues too, who knows? But I think that's definitely something that we need to revisit and take a look more into.
Yeah, lots of directions for future research there. All right, I believe Natasha's up next.
Yes, and thank you so much, Lee, for setting up the presentation that I'm about to give very well. There's a lot that fits together, and you guys did a great job scheduling these. So to start, I want to talk here to extend the idea of the time-based factors Lee was talking about into different trajectories, and how those different team conflict trajectories affect a design project team similar to the ones that Lee studied. We already discussed, so thank you for the introduction, that nearly all teams will experience conflict of different types. More of a healthy debate of task-related conflicts, some of the personal disagreements and clashes that we see in relationship conflict, and logistical challenges relating to people not showing up, for example, to meetings that characterize process conflict. And meta-analytically, we know that members' experiences of the team in these different types of conflict relate to lower satisfaction, less intention to stay in the group, and less member liking. But when we start to look at performance and how they relate to each type of conflict, we see some differences that come out between task conflict in specific situations and the more negative performance effects of relationship and process conflict. Here, task conflict specifically relates to higher performance in non-routine tasks, in decision-making teams, and in teams that have higher psychological safety. So there's something unique going on about these different types of conflict when it comes to how they relate to performance. And really key is to know, but when does this happen? And what exactly is going on when we look at a life cycle approach to teams in general, or project teams specifically. Lee already mentioned conflict contagion just now, and so we know that a lot can happen from the dyadic initial experience of conflict into a whole group perception of it, as well as whether low task conflict can increase relationship conflict later on, contingent on how the team feels that they're performing, as well as how early stages of process conflict or relationship conflict can increase conflict experiences later on. So these differing patterns within the team can affect performance as well as team member satisfaction, two of the key outcomes that we talked about up front. For this study specifically, I want to explore three questions. First of all, what the role is of each conflict type across the team lifecycle, how this conflict types emerge over time, and what affects team performance more, where teams start, or what the trajectory is in terms of the slope of their conflict expression. So similar to Lee, we're working here with student project teams in engineering, completing these minimum viable products for social good, sort of like a capstone project that Lee was talking about. Some examples of what the teams have built include assisted mobility products for the elderly, some beds that help to secure people when they're experiencing tsunamis in Southeast Asian countries, given the kind of healthcare system they have, and really exciting and innovative work that they're doing there. In the first analysis that we'll explore 2 years of these samples, we're looking at 273 teams comprising over 1,100 trainees in small teams of 3 to 6 members each. And here for these three team conflict types, we're looking at our classic measures from Jen's 1995 paper, as well as some process conflict measures from Bafar's paper in 2011. The second analysis that's predicting performance is going to take one of those years in the first analysis that I mentioned and focus on measures of team effectiveness developed by our lab. Looking at first at the relationship and process conflict, we noticed that the intercorrelations were very high within and between teams. So there was a lot of overlap in our sample with relationship and process conflict. For this reason, because of the multicollinearity that could come from that, we focused specifically on relationship and task conflict, and then went forwards to calculate some ICCs here, which are on the low end, but acceptable, and then do some measurement invariance and CFA work. What we notice is within the individual level, the measurement invariance across 4 times was a partial strict measurement invariance, so getting very close to kind of the gold standard of what you would look at for measuring types of conflict over time. And at the team level here, there's a partial strong measurement invariance, so still able to compare these metrics, but those error residuals are going to be a little different, which makes sense given that we started measuring teams right at the beginning of their time together when they just met for the first time. Looking here at the trajectories that I was referring to, we can see that in a generalized mixed model approach, there's 2 classes that emerge out of the 273 teams. Specifically, the relationship conflict shows a really differing trajectory for class 1, 240 teams that have a really steep increase for their relationship conflict scores, going from a very low score on a 1 to 5 scale up into closer to a medium score there. Whereas the other class 2 of only 33 teams has a relatively flat trajectory of relationship conflict. For task conflict, we can see that teams overall start much higher in their ratings of their experience of conflict, and that there's only a slight difference in slope there. These axes are very different, and I apologize for that, but it's very hard to represent them actually on the same scale due to the fact that task conflict stays higher and flatter over time than relationship conflict does. When we use time as a predictor of the scores that we see in these teams, within and across teams, time is a significant predictor of relationship conflict, but not that of task conflict. So there's not a lot going on that differs in what we would consider the debate and perhaps healthy aspects of conflict within these engineering teams. Moving to analysis 2, we can see that at the between team level, relationship and process conflict slopes are predicting team effectiveness here. And they're both predicting them negatively. So the higher the slope, as you could imagine from the trajectories that you just saw, the worse that teams are rating their own effectiveness. Before we add in the slope to this analysis and this multi-level model, we can see that task and process conflict intercepts actually significantly relate to team effectiveness. And that's very interesting because they don't provide anything unique when slopes are involved there, but the initial level of task and process conflict do a lot to determine team effectiveness later on. Within individuals, so we're also able to look at how these conflict scores predict in people's ratings of team effectiveness. And we can see some small positive effects for task conflict, as well as some small negative effects for process conflict on each member's individual perception of how the team is doing. The takeaways here are that there's a lot of overlap in our sample with relationship and process conflict scores, and that these 2 trajectory clusters explain where teams fall in terms of conflict over time. The task and process slopes were the biggest takeaway from analysis 2 in terms of how they measure performance. But I want to focus on how we can move forwards to improve on some of the limitations here. Comparing other rated performance across clusters is a key step for this research program that I'll be working on very soon. And looking at conflict more often, for example, via pulse surveys, such as Kozlowski's talk did a couple of years ago at in-group is really key, as well as incorporating new types of conflict, such as status conflict, and considering different aggregation procedures. If we do have some time left over, Jessica, I'm not sure if we do, feel free to ask some questions.
Yeah, we have a little bit of time. So the one question that occurs to me, and this is a bit of an integrative question too, just in that we've now had a couple papers talking about trajectories and sort of how this conflict is either escalating or de-escalating. It looks like in yours, more escalating. That number, 263, is big over time. I love that you use the slopes to predict. That's very cool. What do you think is really happening there? Is it how much conflict they really end up with? Is it a contrast effect of where they started to where they ended? Any thoughts on really why is it that the slope is predicting?
It's a great question, Jessica.
Are you still there?
Yeah, this is a great question. Sorry, you froze a little bit, so we're having some other technical issues, but I think I did get your point across. And I think what we're seeing in the slope that I'd love to test in some more specific and detailed hypotheses is whether the spillover is happening from some healthy task conflict and where we're seeing low initial relationship conflict, and then that's getting personal. So I imagine that for some of these teams that we're seeing in this one class, the task conflict was taken personally. There was different ways that people had delivered it. The political skill and other aspects that Lee and Matthew talked about are really, I think, key to explaining why some teams will take this healthy conflict that we see consistent over their whole life cycle, and they'll move it into a different area. And it's really the perception and potentially some dyadic things spilling over that could really contribute. There's some high pressure timescales before they present these models to the whole kind of university who's able to come and see them. So I can imagine some of that stress really accelerating that for some teams and pushing at some weaknesses.
Our teams are very similar, very high stress at the end.
Exactly.
All right, thank you. And then our last one, Erica.
Thank you, Jessica. Just confirming that everyone can see my screen here.
Yep, looks good.
Okay, great, thank you. So Dr. Thomas O'Neill and I conducted a study on conflict in engineering design teams. We're both from the University of Calgary. And just based on what we're hearing so far from our panel presenters today, I think there's certainly a lot of similarities and overlap in the kind of sample that we're looking at. So just before I get started into the study itself, I'll talk a little bit here about what engineering design teams are, why they're important, and what infrastructure projects actually look like and why we care. So these engineering design teams really are responsible for a lot of what we're using on a daily basis, a lot of this community infrastructure and critical infrastructure that we rely on. There are things that we see, like the buildings, or even things that we don't see, like the pipes on the ground, the roadways that we drive on, the bridges that we use. And importantly, when these teams fail, it can result in certainly delays, some loss of revenue from companies. There could be attrition. In worst case scenarios, these projects can often end up in litigation. And even worst case scenarios, when these teams fail, the results can actually be catastrophic and even lead to loss of life, which we've seen evidence of in the past in media. And we know from meta-analyses that conflict can play a really important role in how a team is successful or how a team is not successful. So looking at what we see in industry, these engineering teams look more like what we see on this image here compared to what we would call a more traditional team. So you can see that there are more subsets of these teams kind of nested within a larger project organization, if you will. So we'll see teams, multiple teams within a project. But in literature, there still is a focus, certainly in conflict literature, on looking at traditional teams specifically. These are, standalone teams that are not looked at with the sort of external factors or how they connect to other teams. And so, in this past research, the changes that we see in industry and the increasing reliance on more nimble, larger, more complex teams, that right now is more or less being ignored in our current literature. And that leads me to our research question of the role of conflict types in project outcomes like infrastructure projects and engineering design teams. And so we'll talk a little bit here about what we do know from the current research. So looking at conflict profiles, we know that teams that have more task conflict and less relationship and process conflict tend to do a lot better than dysfunctional teams with conflict profiles. And so what we see there in dysfunctional teams are higher rates of relationship conflict and process conflict. We also know that Not all teams look the same, and so there are some teams that engage in what we call boundary spanning activities. And these teams have members that really span outside the realm of what their formal responsibilities are. And this is important because the activities of these boundary spanning team members are heavily tied to group outcomes. Okay, and so back to our engineering project team, that seems to be a context that we're enjoying today. And so why do we care about engineering teams? Well, they work on long-term expensive projects that really impact us as taxpayers. They have a tendency they're required really to make decisions based on very little or ambiguous information. And we know from the conflict literature that ambiguity can certainly lend itself to even more conflict. Engineers are also required to negotiate quite a bit about what they do or might not, what they do require or want or might not want in their design. So in our study, we interviewed 10 professional engineers with over a decade of experience. We conducted semi-structured interviews with these individuals, and using the critical incident technique, we asked them for 2 project examples. One example of a project that went well, one example of a project that did not go so well. And so from that, we did use Jen's 3-part model of conflict types and used thematic analysis. We categorized our data into the buckets of task, relationship, and process conflict, and then looked at how that data emerged in terms of themes within those buckets. And of course, very clearly, very quickly, we saw very strong themes of within team conflict, between team conflict, and then also kind of a catch-all category of external factors. And so within team, what we mean there is within that sub-team of a larger project organization, and then between teams would be still within that umbrella of that project. So we did this with projects with good outcomes, as well as projects with poor outcomes. And so after looking at these themes and how they emerged and they kind of self-categorized into within and between team conflict, we then looked at, we used coding frequencies as a proxy of importance from the participant's perspective. And so here we have the coding frequencies we're moving from left to right here, task, relationship, and process conflict on both sides of the screen. So I'll first point out here that in projects with good outcomes, this profile of higher task conflict, lower relationship, and process conflict is consistent with what we've seen in the past, what we know about conflict profiles and more successful, more productive teams. And then on the left, in these projects with poor outcomes, you'll see that just comparatively, participants spend a lot more effort and a lot more time elaborating on conflict between teams, more so than within teams. And then you'll also see kind of like a mirrored effect of that conflict profile. So much higher levels of process conflict and compared to task conflict. So what we're seeing here really is that between team conflict is possibly as important and maybe even more important than within team conflict on these larger sort of complex industry teams. And we see that within team conflict profiles is consistent with what we've seen in past literature. We see that process conflict tends to dominate these projects with poor outcomes. This is kind of as an aside here about the external factors that when they do occur, they have quite large magnitude impacts on these projects and how these teams interact in terms of conflict. So theoretical implications. So first of all, what's important here is that within team conflict by itself, which is most of the focus of the current literature, that alone cannot accurately predict how a team will perform in industry. These industry teams tend to have more complex builds, more complex organizations. And so looking at the dynamic between teams is at least as equally important. The study also lays more groundwork for further research and investigation into conflict in a fuller multi-team system approach, sort of zooming out of the engineering perspective across different industry multi-team systems. And then also there's the assumption that team members tend to have a shared perception of what conflict is. from this study, we know that that was not the case, and that it was there are so many competing priorities, and so that shared perception of conflict does not hold true in these teams. And then lastly, process conflict tends to be understudied, but it seems from this study that there might be something more there. It might play a more important role than we've thought in the past. In terms of practical implications, conflict is expensive. It, especially if we look at the role of process conflict in projects that don't go well. And so this could be mitigated by better project management practices. And when we talk about litigation, I mean, certainly there are intervention measures that could be considered at earlier phases of a project life cycle so that it doesn't lead to litigation. So in terms of limitations, certainly this takes the perspective of one individual team member. We don't have the perspective of all team members. The gender representation of the sample was it was fully male, which is somewhat reflective of the actual population, but there might be more that could be done there. And with any qualitative study, interviewer bias could be a challenge. So in terms of the next step, really it's more qualitative efforts on multi-team systems in the field. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Erica. And so actually can you hear me? It says my internet is unstable.
We can hear you.
Okay. Let me know if I stop moving again. So one of the questions I really love, again, that you highlight there, that between team element. I actually was on a consulting project a while back, and they brought us in to look at trust within teams. And lo and behold, by the end of the project, we came to a very similar conclusion, which is your problem's not within teams, it's between teams. So I think that really does reflect this more complex sort of structure, especially in these industries where the problems are big and require multiple teams to handle them. So what do you think, just some ideas in terms of how does conflict really look different or unique? What do we need to be thinking about when we talk about conflicts between teams rather than just within teams?
Yeah, so the challenge there really is as a representative of your own organization, there are limits to what can be negotiated. So the between team conflict no longer becomes just about conflict between team members, but more so about as representatives of those organizations. And there are a lot of power dynamics that come into play. Certainly when we look at within team structures, we look at, your typical, let's say, manager and then employee relationships. But beyond that, when we're looking at between team, there are a lot of relationships that kind of cross those thresholds. So that's when we talk about, when we look at boundary spanning team members, they cross different facets of sectors, of industries, and of supervisory levels. And so there can be a lot of challenges there in terms of how those power dynamics really play out into whether a conflict, who wins a conflict. And when an individual project team member might win, the organization might not win. And so, when we look at the network, we've talked a little bit about the network lens of conflict, and that could probably be a very useful lens to examine conflict in these multi-team systems.
All right. Then sort of a next question, I think I'll do this one because I think we don't have a ton of time. But I really love just the connections between the papers in terms of a few about conflict expression, a few about conflict type, a few using, qualitative, quant, like it's a very nice spread. One of my first thoughts was, are these theories, conflict type and conflict expression, I think we already hinted at, they're more complementary than controversial or competing. So where do we see connections there? And I'll throw one out that I sort of thought of to begin with. Again, this debate idea. I wonder, can you theoretically debate over any conflict type? Can you actually debate over a personality clash, or is that not theoretically possible? So where do we see these things either intersecting or combining? How do we use these together moving forward? Any thoughts?
I can actually offer some thoughts on that. So I think that theoretically speaking, conflict type and conflict expression are distinct. but I think that I think that within certain types of conflict, we would expect to see certain types of conflict expression maybe more associated with those types of conflict. So I could imagine, maybe it might seem strange to think about debate being part of relationship conflicts, but it can be, but possibly just less. But it could be that, somebody has a certain personality element that interacts a certain way with the way things are happening on a team, and somebody does approach that in a very debate-like manner. So one thing I'm thinking about is perhaps somebody is very introverted, never wants to speak up at meetings or something like that. That can be approached from a debate point of view. So you could go up to that person and say, we need everybody to participate, these types of things. Can we talk about this? But I do feel like those types of relationship elements probably devolve to arguing, undermining, disguising more often, but not necessarily.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do want to kind of chime on to that. I guess it's like my kind of viewing on that is like, especially like thinking about like, one thing I really guess is kind of cool and also kind of interesting to think about is like, if it's a relationship conflict, can you really debate? My stance on that and my view on it is like less about the debate itself, but more so from like kind of like the OG of like what Weingart talk about in the conflict expression theory, like really diving into that aspect of like directness and oppositional intensity, right? And what's really cool about this, and this is going to be outside of like research a bit, but I watched The Good Place, and I was watching that at the time when I was also working on and reading a lot of this conflict expression theory, and it really kind of enabled me to kind of think about life and being a good human to another person, right? Connecting the ethic with the theory itself. And I was just like, well, you can still, to a certain extent, like if we don't frame it as debate, but instead we frame it just be direct with someone and actually being kind to them by not entrenched in your own view of who they are, and don't try to subversive or changing how they should be, then you should still be fine. And I do think, personally, I do believe that relationship conflict to a certain extent, if we approach it from that aspect of like directness and low oppositional intensity, we can still resolve some of those conflict there.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a great question, Jessica, and I want to let you get to some other ones too, but I hope that other people have, expanded their view of these things as I have being on this panel, because I think the types that I was exploring, it's almost maybe a symptom of the way that expression was done and the way that people have interpreted that. And I think then we can see that there's some distinctions that need to be made within these different conflict types, because of course they emerge after people have expressed themselves, even if it wasn't intended to be a conflict. I think that adds a lot of new nuance and color to the types kind of argument, and predicts the membership in different profiles, Erica, like you've seen in your lab.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I don't know if we have any more time for other comments, so I'll just kind of leave it open for final remarks or final thoughts. You just have to have our audience here. Nope. All right. Well, with that, I guess we'll say goodbye to our virtual audience, and thank you all for showing up today. And hopefully, if there are any questions, you can reach out to the authors of all of these great papers, and we would be happy to start a discussion, and maybe we'll see people around at some of the in-group online social events.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.